This is Solo in the Shop. This week, we're going to talk about the good old days, how technology fits in our shop, but there's always a place for the tried and true, the methods from the good old days. Whether you are a hobbyist, weekend warrior, making commissions for friends and family, or already a full-time maker, if you are solo in your shop, this is the show for you. I'm Ronald Lowe's, the host of Solo in the Shop, a woodworking podcast discussing everything from current projects, tools and techniques, decisions around running a small business, and much more. So if you frequently find yourself alone and covered in sawdust, follow my journey and we can be solo in the shop together. The inspiration for this episode came from listening to another podcast, the Founders Podcast, doing a profile of Hans Wilsdorf, the founder of Rolex. It tells how in the early days of Wilsdorf's life, pocket watches were the only watches that men would carry. Wilsdorf learned about the watch business in Switzerland, where he learned about importing and reselling other people's watches. And when he first got into the watch business for himself, that was his business model. He would buy watches from overseas from lots of different manufacturers. He would add his markup and he would resell those watches. However, men were not wearing wrist watches. At the time, these were called bracelet watches or wristlet watches, and they were only worn by women as jewelry. The idea of wearing a watch on your wrist was seen as very feminine. However, Hans Wilsdorf foresaw that men in the very near future would ditch the pocket watch and start wearing them on their wrist. But first, there were several problems that needed to be worked out. Problems such as durability, being able to make a watch that was small, had tons of small parts, but would still be able to stand up to daily use. Problems such as dealing with the environment, keeping out dirt and water so that the watch would continue to keep time. And then accuracy, being able to have a watch that would keep accurate time for as long as you wore it was a challenge that, if you think about pocket watches, they were getting wound all the time. You know, it was almost like check the time, wind the watch, check the time, wind the watch. And we needed to get past that. It wasn't until World War I that men started wearing watches on their wrist, and they were called trench watches. And it was a way for soldiers to coordinate operations so that rather than having to dig into their pocket, they could just look at their wrist. And everybody, I'm envisioning the scene in the movies where they're like, okay, everybody synchronize your watches, 3, 2, 1, mark. So it wasn't until wartime in the early 1900s that men started to wear watches on their wrist. Now you fast forward almost 100 years and the Apple Watch comes out. Smartwatches are on people's wrist. You can not only tell time, but you can take phone calls, you can text, you can check your heart rate, your blood pressure. And now, after 15 years of that, there's been a resurgence of traditional watches on your wrist that men are wearing both to keep time and for fashion. I myself have a watch that my wife got me. It is a beautiful stone. It's got a granite face, and then it has black walnut around the bezel and around the wrist, which is very appropriate for my woodworking lifestyle. And so it kind of harkens back to those good old days, getting back to wearing a regular watch that keeps time, and that's all it does. I love that watch. At the same time as all of this watch stuff is happening, I recently just installed a new pencil sharpener in my shop. This may seem like a small deal, but for me, having a sharp pencil being able to draw a nice crisp line is pretty important. And I was really unsatisfied with not only the little manual plastic pencil sharpeners. I even have one that's built into my tape measure, which started out really good. I was pretty enthusiastic about that, and it was very convenient. I always had the tape measure, I always had the pencil, and they just got together. But over time, that little pencil sharpener in the tape measure has gotten worse and worse and less effective, and I'm just not happy with it anymore. Electric pencil sharpeners feel as underpowered as, I don't want to insult Prius owners, but you know what I mean. They're underpowered. I want a little horsepower getting into sharpening my pencil. So I went back to the kind of pencil sharpener I grew up with, which was like screwed into the wall. It had the removable oval shape and a hand crank on the side. And man, this thing makes a razor sharp point, and I love it. At the same time, I've been using my chisels a lot more in the shop, not necessarily for things like you might imagine with dovetails and things like that, but just for cleaning up. So if there's a little tear out or there's some wood sticking up after I make a mortise, I'm grabbing the chisels and cleaning that stuff up with the chisel. And keeping those chisels sharp, obviously, makes quick work of these things. And I love being able to get in there with some hand tools and some delicate control and work on that kind of precision woodworking. I have planes, I have, the Japanese pull saws, I have saws for cutting dovetails. I've said before that I want to become very proficient with those, and I'm slowly working those into each project. However, if I were going to make furniture just using hand tools, my friend from New Janky Workshop recently went to Colonial Williamsburg. I'm going there next month myself, and he was posting tons of pictures of the very cool old tools that they were using even now to recreate making chairs and making cabinets using all of these old hand tools. But if you were to do that now, the prices that you would need to charge to economically make sense for the time invested into each piece of furniture, those prices would be astronomical. So building from start to finish with hand tools doesn't make sense. Just like it doesn't make sense to rip a sheet of plywood with a handsaw. It does make sense to embrace technology. Using a CNC or using the Shaper Origin, which I love, neither of those things do I see as cheating. I see those as tools that allow the small woodworker to be efficient and profitable. The same goes with power tools. Having a planer, having a jointer, using those to jumpstart a project rather than trying to do it all with hand planes just makes complete sense. Using a table saw, a miter saw, using a router, these all make sense for building furniture. But using those tools, I feel, is a way to fast forward your project so that you can get it to a point that's very close. And then you're into the hand tool world, and that's where your hand skill, craftsmanship, artfulness get applied. And there is satisfaction and charm in finishing a project using hand tools, just like there is charm and maybe even nostalgia in being able to draw the lines on the furniture with a very sharp pencil that was sharpened in my hand crank pencil sharpener, to be able to know what time it was when I finished because I can just glance down at my wristwatch. That's all I have for you this week. I hope you enjoyed the show. For now, I'm going to grab myself a sarsaparilla out of the icebox and go listen to some records on my Victrola. Just keeping in mind the good old days.
If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to reach out to me at solointheshop@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you got value from it and would like to help the show grow, I'd appreciate a review wherever you listen. Be sure to check the show notes for links to my socials or any extra stuff we discussed today. Until next time, stay safe in your shop, and we'll talk again soon.